Thank you, Iran, for that warm introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry that we're running late. I'll try and be short. I'm very pleased to be part of this event, and particularly pleased that Ephraim Karsh is now the director. I do have connections to this university. I received the Guardian of Zion Award in 2006, and my grandparents are named chair here, the Marcel and Maria Roth Chair in the History and Culture of Polish Jewry from the Middle Ages to the Present. Quite a mouthful, but a distinguished chair held by Professor Bacon. My topic is Islamism. Interestingly, it has hardly come up today. I'll make 2 points. A brief one, that the Eastern Mediterranean is important, and the second one, that Islamism is important in the Eastern Mediterranean. By Eastern Mediterranean, I mean, with all due respect to the foreign minister, 8 countries starting with Greece and going down to Libya. I did not include Albania, sorry. Greece, okay, you agree, good. Greece, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Cyprus, counting Cyprus as one country, and Israel, Egypt, and Libya. I'd like to start with a quote from Professor Aristotle Tsiampiris of the University of Piraeus, who argues that this particular region should be seen as a distinct new region in world affairs because it's recovering from a long period, he calls it 500 years, of decline in importance, when the Atlantic Rim was the important place, not here. He says that the Eastern Mediterranean constitutes possibly, I'm quoting, the most important border within East and West. In today's Eastern Mediterranean, the forces of modernity, democracy, secularism, peace, and toleration, let us say the best of the West, meet and invariably clash with the forces and ideologies of authoritarianism, theocracy, terrorism, intolerance, fundamentalism, and perpetual conflict, or what he calls the worst of the East. Now, Islamism is hardly the only issue here. Let me note in passing that 4 great powers are vying for influence in this region. Looking at them from weakest to strongest, you have the European Union, which is ineffectual but with a long legacy in the area. Russia, which is a dying power that is making hay while it has the means to do so. The United States, which has been notably ineffectual the last 8 years and is claiming to come back. We'll see if that happens. And China, which is a name that has not been mentioned all day, as far as I remember, which is building investments and ties for the long term. Very, very important. It's quiet, subtle, but underneath the hot things taking place, the Chinese are building. Also very important and not much emphasized today is the new energy reserves. The U.S. Geological Service estimates it's 3.5 billion cubic meters, which if it were a country, a single country, would make it about 13th largest reserve in the world, about the same as Australia. By way of comparison, Russia has the most with 48 billion cubic meters. So it's by far not the largest, but it's certainly significant. We've talked at length about the Syrian refugee crisis, the largest since World War II, and the effects it's had. But I'm going to focus now on Islamism. And I'd like to divide these 8 countries into 2. Those that are exporting it and those that are importing it. Exporting it are Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Libya. Importing it are Greece, Cyprus, and Israel. You can put it a different way, majority Muslim and minority Muslim. In Turkey, what we see is a very important development, namely the rebellion of those who never liked Ataturk's reforms against the Ataturk revolution of 1923 to 1938. It's at the same time a reassertion, or a would-be reassertion, of Ottoman influence over the region, an attempt to build in a non-violent way and a Turkish influence in the areas where Turkey was once influential, such as Libya, where Turkey has had an important role, the conflict with Egypt, the conflict and making up and so forth with Israel, obviously the intense involvement in Syria, intense involvement in Cyprus, the intense relationship with Greece and beyond. My prediction for Turkey is that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the enormously skilled politician who has dominated the country since 2002, will continue to dominate it domestically and go from strength to strength. The April vote will be to give him all the powers he wants. He already has them, but this will make it official. But my prediction is that he will encounter problems internationally, that he is so skilled domestically, that he assumes he is so skilled internationally, but he's not. And I'm reluctant to make this comparison because they're really two very different kinds of leaders, but there is a similarity between Erdogan and Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein completely dominated Iraq, and he completely messed up internationally, whether it be Iran or Kuwait or other foreign adventures. And I think on a much more modest scale, much less vicious scale, the Turkish leader will have similar problems. Syria, the key event in Syria was 51 years ago when the Alawi people, the peoples of the Alawi faith, took power in Syria in 1966. And it's funny to recount this to you, but I was for 15 years a Syria specialist, wrote 3 books on it. And I had argued at the time, somewhat unexceptionally, that this was the key divide, Sunni Alawi. Alawi is what's called an extreme Shiite sect. It's basically wandered off from Islam, but still calls itself Muslim. But it has really very little in common with Islam. And it's about 1/8 of the population of Syria is Alawi, mostly in the northwest. And I argued in the 80s that the 90s that the key issue was Alawi Sunni. And I can't tell you how scorned this point of view was by fellow scholars of Syria who insisted that it was rural-urban, that the great divide of Syria was rural-urban. Well, I think not. I think it is Alawi Sunni, and what we saw in 2011 was a Sunni reassertion. What we've been seeing on the battlefield are various forms of Islamist reassertion. Syria is very complex. To put it simply, there are 4 major elements, whatever we're going to call it, ISIS, ISIL, ICE, Daesh, by itself, and the regime, and the other Sunni rebels, and the Kurds. And the interesting thing about Syria is everybody's fighting everybody with one exception. ISIS is not fighting the regime is not fighting ISIS. Otherwise, there's 6 different civil wars there. I tend to think, Jonathan Spire gave a great analysis, gave the 3 possibilities. I tend to think that Syria will not come back together. And I'd say the same for Iraq. In rather parallel fashion, these 2 states of Sykes-Picot of 101 years ago are broken. Each of them has a Kurdish part that wants to be separate. Each of them has a central government that is Shiite-oriented, backed by the Iranians. And each of them has a Sunni Islamist rebellion that will break it. Lebanon is basically in Syria's shadow, but it's got enough verve to make its own mischief. Hezbollah has become a serious power in Syria. And there's this bizarre coalition between the Christians, especially the Maronites, and the Shia of Lebanon. It's extraordinary that the country's taken in an estimated 1.5 million refugees from Syria and only has a population of 4.5. So it has increased by 1/3. And it is a very weak and poor government, but it has a very strong civil society that so far has held. It has not broken down. One wishes it well, but one wonders how many more refugees it can take before it does break down. In Egypt, the key fact is the military took over in 1952, and with the exception of 1 year, it has controlled it ever since. And if you're looking for cultural dynamism, economic growth, and so forth, don't hire the military to run your country. If you compare Egypt of 1952 with Egypt of 65 years later, it's a very poor and dismal place indeed. The autocracy of Hosni Mubarak lasted 30 years, from 1981 to 2011. The liberal youth started the rebellion against him. The Islamists joined in. The military agreed. And he was gone in a matter of days. After the interregnum of Mohammed Morsi, an Islamist. General Sisi, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, has taken over, and he's ruling with a much more iron fist than Mubarak ever did. An obsession with defeating, destroying the Islamists, and I'm pretty anti-Islamist myself, but I worry that he's gone too far, he's not paying enough attention to the economy, and that he will lose power and the Islamists will come back, and this time they'll stay. It will not be an interregnum. This time the Muslim Brotherhood will be in power for a long time. And finally, of the 5 exporting states, Libya, we see an Islamist rebellion mostly in Cyrenaica versus a tyranny mostly in Tripolitania. I recommend the BESA study by our chairman, Eran Lerman, which is, for my money, the best single short analysis of what's taken place in Libya since the insurrection began. And as he points out, the geographic, tribal, and ideological divisions, it's very complex. The UN intervention has made it all the more so. The Egyptian intervention, the Egyptian versus Turkish tensions. And so now the main battle is between Fayez Sarraj's internationally recognized government of national accord and Khalifa Haftar's Egyptian-backed Libyan National Army. The Islamists are on the defensive, but it's kaleidoscopic and it can change, and it does change. And then to turn to the 3 importing countries. First there's Greece, which has had its share of economic problems, as we heard just before. It's the center of Europe for some time. Its political problems, a novice government come to power, the migrant situation. The Turks have made it clear they can turn that off and on. There were just recently some notes from a meeting between the president of the European Union, Tusk, and Juncker, with Erdogan, and he was just telling them, you know, I'll do what I want. You better do as I wish, because I can have the migrants come anytime I want. Greece is essentially a country that does not control its destiny, whether it be economic or Islamist. In Cyprus, we see the archaic Greek-Turkish divide. And what's so striking here is the lack of Syrian refugees. It's 109 kilometers from Syria to Cyprus. I don't want to give anybody ideas, but it sure seems like a tool that the Turkish government could exploit against its nemesis in Cyprus. And finally, Israel. I love a quote from Ehud Barak. Don't love too much about Ehud Barak, but I love this quote. In 2002, he called Israel a villa in the jungle. And if it was true in 2002, it's even more true today. Yes, the Islamist threat looms here too, with Iran and the nuclear buildup, posing a unique danger. But as the former director of BESA, Ephraim Inbar, put it, the Palestinians are, at the end of the day, a strategic nuisance. They don't really threaten the state in the way that Iran does. There is no refugee crisis here. Fences, we learned, do work. There was building a crisis, and now it's diminished. There's quite extraordinary economic growth. Israel's become a superpower in high tech, in water tech, counterterrorism, and even, for example, in classical music. It is the only state of the 8 that I've mentioned that controls its destiny. The only state that controls its destiny. I mean, nobody controls entirely one's own destiny, but insofar as the normal rules apply, Israel controls its destiny in a way that none of the other 7 do. And as the years go by, this achievement is all the more impressive. So let's hope that, like Greece and Cyprus of late, the other neighbors of the region also realize how much they can learn from this country, starting with water, but so much more. I mean, there were rather cool relations over the decades with Greece and Cyprus, but as we've heard several times today, those have warmed up. And I would hope that they would warm up with other neighbors in the region as well. Thank you.